to say a few things about it?
It was definitely interesting. I felt like it was a lot I kind of knew about.
Stand up.
Goodness.
You can swim the camera.
She just basically talks about her program, where she works with transgender kids and their parents, and just talks about their lives and what they've been through. And then the end, the questions that really got to me when the mother talked about her child and all he has been through with transitioning and. It was,
That was in the question and answer period?
yes, yeah.
Because I left.
Oh, right. No, that, yes, it was interesting.
Okay. Basically, this is a woman who is teaching a human development program at Miami University in Ohio. And someone approached her about trying to understand her transgender child and how to deal with the issues. And so she's, and some others started this longitudinal study where she's studying the families, the interactions, the children themselves, and what they're dealing with, which is very timely because we're seeing lots of issues legally around trans kids right now, the bathrooms that they use and the events that they can participate in and so on. So just to provide us with a little definition, these are, there she is, the winner of last week's story. So trans kids are children who identify as not the sex they were born as. So they, clothes are a very important part of this, and that was mentioned several times, that small boys who were always into really frilly clothes and they wanted to wear those clothes and identify with that. So it was quite interesting to hear that. And I think she's continuing with the study and will be reporting more on what happens with these kids when they get to be teenagers and young adults. So that was interesting. Okay, so today we have a guest who's going to be presenting with me because we're working on a project together. It's Dr. Abby Lillithan. Once upon a time she taught here and decided to go closer to where her actual home is to work. So now she's at Montclair State University where she teaches in a program that's similar to ours. So for several years now, we have been on a bandwagon to talk about fashion history and why it's just the West. Because any fashion history course that you look at, it only talks about Europe and America, and not about Asia or Africa or South America or Mexico or any other culture, but just Western European heritage. So we're trying to change how people think about this, and we're going to explain to you our project today.
Yes, we are.
Yes. So, welcome to Abby. Thank you for coming up. You spent your spring break?
Yeah, spring break in Montclair. Here I am in Rhode Island. It's not that bad though. It's a beautiful day. Yeah, so as you probably know, Dr. Walters is a historian, and I'm a cultural historian also, with a focus on fashion. When I taught here, I taught in the cultural studies, the culture area. I taught the ethnic dress class, for instance. I taught history once, but I taught ethnic dress. So we've titled our presentation Fashion History, A Global View. And at the end of the presentation, we'll tell you a little bit more about that title. A couple of years ago, we made a presentation and we called it Redefining Fashion. Because in our investigations as historians, we come across this concept of fashion as something relatively narrow and specific. But we came to this definition and we published it in our book in 2011. Here's our book. So the Fashion Reader, it's the second edition of the Fashion Reader. We had a first edition in 2007 and then an expanded and revised second edition in, 2007, and then revised and expanded in 2011. But you can see the definition up there. It's very broad. It is, fashion is changing styles of dress and appearance that are adopted by a group of people at any given time and place. So, change, adopted by a group, any place, right? So that's a very broad definition. It doesn't bring it to a narrow kind of scope. But we'd like to tell you how we got there. That's sort of the presentation today. I'll let you speak.
Okay, so, we look at the definition of fashion. Okay, we look at the definition of fashion compared to some of the other titles that we see applied to what we wear. So fashion is changing styles in dress, but some people say fashion applies to other types of material products and even behaviors, such as, you could think of fashions in cooking. Certainly the kinds of things that we grew up eating as in our families are not the same kinds of things that we have today. In fact, pizza was brand new when I was growing up. And it also applies to cars and houses and all kinds of things. So fashion is, there's some, it's a contested word that has different meanings depending on who you're talking to. And then some are arguing that dress is the preferred title because it encompasses all forms of body coverings, including makeup, hair, accessories, and it doesn't exclude things that aren't considered fashion. Then if you tell this to somebody else, oh, I studied dress, they're going to be like, dress? You study dresses? Again, that's an issue. So there's no perfect, that is not a perfect word either. And then costume is a word that has been in use for a long time for these kinds of courses. Historic costume used to be called that here. Lots of books still, textbooks still refer to historic costume. But at this point, when we don't say, well, what costume are you going to wear today? Unless it's Halloween, or you're going to some kind of, what is that called? The costume? The comic?
Comic-Con.
Comic-Con, where you're dressing up as your favorite Star Wars character. In theater, we refer to costume in theater. If you dress up in something that's not your everyday persona, that's costume. So that's the meaning that it has today. And therefore, historic costume doesn't seem quite right, because at the time people were dressing up thinking it was an outfit that represented another period of time or a personality situation that doesn't relate to the present day. So a fairly recent book, this is just last year, Pravina Shukla, she's at Indiana, University of Indiana in Bloomington. She wrote a book called Costume, but what she covers in this is Halloween costume, national dress. So if you grow up in Sweden and on the weekends or for special events you wear the Swedish costume of your locale. What else did she, I think she had, I read this before it was printed, a number of other different costumes. And it's not something you wear on an everyday basis. It's a dress-up kind of thing, is her point. So that is the correct use of the term costume. So we try to go back and see how costume history got established in our programs and why it sometimes is still called costume. And way back in 1911, over 100 years ago, it was recommended as an essential course in a curriculum that would be a textile curriculum. Even at URI, we had textiles, clothing, and related art was the name of our major for a long time. And there was a woman, Jane Fales, who wrote what should be included in a course of costume history in 1911. And pretty much this was followed for many, many years, into the 70s, 80s. And at first there were no textbooks because it's sort of a new area to be studying. And then some landmark textbooks were developed. Blanche Payne wrote one that was used for many years. That was the first really great one from, she was at Washington State University, University of Washington. She traveled a lot and collected a lot of information and redrew some images and made patterns of them and so on. So it was a really good academic book. Recently, a book by Phyllis Tortora, it's been the best-selling costume book. And we'll show a picture of that later because of the structure that she chooses to use in that book. So, yes.
So, costume history copied art history. Art history was already a discipline before costume history was a discipline, as in a scholarly discipline taught at universities, right? Sort of from a perspective of connoisseurship, to look at the object, analyze the object, do it with a systematic method of analysis, and you're looking at the artwork, the sculpture, etc. So we followed that model in terms of objects, but also in terms of the way the information would be presented. And I mean we, the discipline, not we, Dr. Welters and myself, right? So the discipline followed this model, which typical courses structure would be like this. You would cover ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt. And then jump over to Europe after you get through that ancient world chunk. And then after Europe, once there's colonization in North America, enfold what happens in North America as we establish a fashion system by these definitions here in North America. So after colonization. And as I said, we use the art sources as an example. So we'll pause here. How many people know this painting? Yeah, many, many, many. Anybody remember the title?
See it? Art history. Which one? Carl, okay.
Carl's class.
Okay, Carl's class.
But
Yeah, art history.
from the
Which
art
course
history
did you
department.
take? 252, okay.
The Marriage of Arnolfini, right, by Jan van Eyck.
So if we look at even what's going on at URI for programs, for courses in the art history department, they're, we should say, pretty basic, and they follow the model that we just, that Dr. Littleton just outlined. We have two courses, Art History 251, Art History 252. A lot of students take both of these courses, and therefore you get a good overview of Western art history. Because you don't really talk about Asia or anywhere else. African art doesn't come in that. And then the upper level courses kind of amplify what you would have learned in some of those basic courses, because there's ancient Mediterranean art, medieval art, Renaissance art, Baroque art, 19th century art, and 20th century art, and American art. So it's all still expanding on just the basic Western art history. And because of Robert Dilworth, there's African art and African artists in the 20th and 21st century, those courses. But nothing else. Okay, so we'd like to talk to the art history department about getting a little more inclusive also. Okay, so the best-selling textbook in our area, we know the publishers, and they say this is the Fairchild, this is the book that they sell the most of. It's huge, it's expensive. It is now in its 6th edition, which shows how successful it has been in the marketplace. So this means that almost all students who are taking costume history courses today, I mean, it's also called historic costume. They haven't changed the title to get more modern, to say dress or fashion. It's still costume. And probably because when it started, I can't remember when, 6th edition, it was
Was
probably
25
out in
years.
80, 25 years.
So,
That was 1980, so still people were getting into the whole discussion of whether it should be costume or dress at that point. And if we look at her major parts, because there are 6 parts in this book, it follows the same order. Ancient world, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Baroque and Rococo, 19th century, and 20 to 21st century. So we take issue with this.
yeah, we take issue with that. So you saw that parallel, right? Art history model, costume history model. So we identified 2 major problems in how we define fashion. And those are the things we've been working on, the 2 problems. So problem number 1 in fashion history literature is a statement that is carried on throughout most of these publications very blatantly. Fashion begins in 14th century European courts. That's it. Without much documentation, it's just that's when it begins. But we can trace, because this is what we worked on, to try and figure out why and how this statement came to be accepted knowledge and then passed on for the last many years, since the 1960s. So that's a claim that was made without justification that has been accepted knowledge. So that's a problem, right? If you think logically or if you think like a scholar, which you all are, things need to have reference and background and documentation and evidence. But this statement didn't, but it was accepted, just rewritten by many people. So we note here a few. One is Stella Mary Newton. I don't really mean to put a big blame on her, because she's actually a British scholar, who wrote about dress in the 14th century. And after her, all the others started claiming that's when fashion began. But she never made the statement. She didn't make the statement. She's just cited as having made the statement, because we have looked it up. And then some of those that follow her, her work and are citing her as if she said that are Francois Boucher, who I know the professors know as one of the great influential French fashion or costume historians, James Laver, a very, very influential 20th century British scholar, and then Fernand Braudel. I'll let Dr. Welters talk about Fernand Braudel.
He's French, and he blatantly says that he cites some of these other people. So he's looking at the fashion histories and saying, oh, it's the 14th century. And the reason why is that clothes started to be fitted to the body, not loose tunics and draped things. They started to be fitted to the body, which ignores fashion in fabrics or fashion in other ways of expression on the body. He just says it's tailored clothing that makes it fashion. So we're going to show you how some of the other things he says about that. So, 14th century was also the time period, if you've taken medieval history or early modern history, where people started getting away from their castles and moving into towns and trading and developing money instead of just exchange labor for product through a barter system. You get capitalists. And some of the capitalists are able to rise quite high in the social system. You've got the open society mobile class system. You can name the most important ones were from Florence, and they married into the French royal family. So they're moving along, moving right up the class system. And towns grow, there's stores, there are marketplaces, open marketplaces and so on, which allow people to see what others are doing and so on. So that's why they're linking fashion to this market economy. And what they're excluding in Europe, because not everybody in Europe dressed in fashion, according to these authorities, they say traditional dress. These are peasants, which is a bad word nowadays. You don't say peasant, but oh, you peasant is not a good thing to say. So you can say rural person, that would be more appropriate, but we call this folk dress, ethnic dress, national dress, regional dress, local dress, aboriginal, oops, they got mushed together, aboriginal. And so we have here Icelandic dress. This is something that Karl Asplund has studied. And he's found that there's definite changes. Actually, it's kind of invented in the first place as a way to link people who live in a certain place with their place by wearing a specific locally styled outfit, although these look quite a lot like other Northern European traditional dresses from the early 19th century. Anyway, it goes through lots of changes, so it has a fashion of its own, is our point about this. Okay, then the ancient world.
Right, so other things that might be excluded by this concept of fashion originating in the 14th century and only functioning within capitalistic, mobile status sort of cultures like ours, right? It's people defining it as if it exists in their own world. You get my point, I hope. So what about other places or times? You know, other opportunities for fashion to have existed. Is there that potential? For instance, before the 14th century or in other geographic places? We think there is. So just three nice examples here. Is this not fashion? I'm asking you. So we're looking at the charioteer of Delphi. This is a male figure. How many of you know this figure from art history? So some of you took the earlier art history. So this is a male figure and is inspirational to fashion designers today. But he's a charioteer in the middle of ancient Greece. Sorry.
You should know that from TMD 240, because the Delphos dress is developed out of charioteer of Delphi.
The Fortuny Delphos dress, right? You guys know that? 1906. Inspired by this. And in the middle you see a redrawing of a wall painting from Egypt, which shows, would be the Bronze Age, which is before the charioteer of Delphi historically. But what we see are multiple layers of clothing that are made from sheer fabric, so you can see through the surface, and then surface pleating to add ornamentation rather than embroidery or something, and then ornate jewelry. Of course, this is an elite individual. Bands of jewelry on the wrists, you know, a definite style that has bands around the neck, bands around the wrists, and usually a belt, but not so visible in this one. And then the third image is, I have now forgotten which emperor, but it's Augustus Caesar? Anyone know that sculpture? Oops. Sorry, but it's a Roman statue, and he's wearing a toga with other aspects of imperial Roman dress. Beautifully rendered, lots of movement, many layers of cloth. But according to the definition that had developed by the late 1960s, this is not fashion. What do you think? That would be the question I want you to ponder. In addition, there's other things that would be excluded aside from, say, outside of Europe in Egypt or prior to 1400, like all of those examples. And of course, there could be many more examples. But then we would think about things that are loose-fitting, because Dr. Welters just explained, well, oh no, fashion supposedly started when we fitted clothing to the body. We started cutting cloth and fitting it to the body, because that was what happened, according to those historians, in the 1400s. So I'd like you to speak about the Middle Ages.
All right, so just prior to this period where they start fitting to the body, there's tunics. They're just loose T-shaped garments made out of some pretty interesting fabrics, because we see a striped fabric here with these two falconers. And then there are these long robes for important persons, and then a draped mantle over. So the conclusion from some fashion historians is that this is prior to actual fashion. But they say that, okay, it's the cutting and so on, fitting to the body. So here we see a woman from the mid-1400s who's cutting a sleeve. Right? So we've got the shape of the sleeve, and actually adding sleeves was supposed to be a part of this development of fashion. And one of the most important garments for the early development of fashion is the pourpoint of Charles de Blois of the mid-14th century. It's in Lyon. You know, some of you were thinking about going to that Lyon program. This is very fitted. It was designed to be worn under armor, so it wouldn't hurt your body. And it's padded and quilted and very close to the body. So people started wearing this on its own, mended with a hose. So they're showing off their legs, but not a tunic, loose-fitting tunic. And then extremisms in dress. That's another thing that's argued as the feature of fashion. So these are these very long pointed shoes called poulaines or krakows. And there's lots of images of those from 14th and 15th century. They're even so long that you have to tie them up so that you don't trip over your shoe. So this kind of extremism that we see in fashion, like super padded shoulders of the 1980s. I would argue right now the deep cleavage where you have to tape your dress on so you're not completely having a wardrobe malfunction. Those are extremisms. The bustle is an example of this extremism, but it started really early with these. At least that's one of the features of fashion according to this early definition. But there's also long sleeves. So here, this is right around 1340 when it's sort of the year pinpointed by some individuals of when fashion starts. So we see this woman who has a fairly fitted dress and these long sleeves that hang out. And here is a casket. It doesn't mean a funereal casket, it means a little box that's carved. And we see this, okay, this guy right here is wearing one of those short tunics that have several different names depending on which language you're studying it in. So that's a fashionable item for him. And here we see a woman on horseback being courted. She's wearing a fancy hat and the long trailing sleeves. And even quite recently, there was an exhibition at the Pierpont Morgan Museum in New York that was about illuminated manuscripts, and it repeated this idea of fashion starting in the 14th century. So, this brings us to our critique of this. We say fashion starts earlier than the 14th century. We show some examples of this in primary sources. Romance literature is one of them, and sumptuary laws. So, Romance literature. These are stories from France, written quite early about court life. And these are dated 1100s. So that's a couple centuries before the 1340 date. So here's something from 1160 to 1165, the Prise d'Orange, I guess. And it's talking about a woman who is very enticing because of her fashion. Okay? She's wearing silk, but she's wearing a blio. This is a new garment that's laced up on the side. And it's revealing her body to poor Guillaume, who is trembling because he's seeing her body. So we found some images that show these blios. It's not the fitted tunic anymore, it's the loose tunic anymore. It's what they did was lace up the side seam so that it would fit tightly to the body. And sometimes in the summer you could actually see the skin. They got all excited about this stuff. But this is happening 2 centuries before they say that fashion began in Europe. And then sumptuary laws. We know what these are?
Who knows? Anybody?
Okay, it's a law that's regarding what you can and can't wear. So mostly it's what you can't wear. So
I just want to say, mostly it's what you can't wear because they're railing about something, right? They're angry, so they want to set a law to prevent you from doing something.
Anyway, in Florence, these are laws that are attempting to rule dress behavior. So actually it was the clergy who are the ones who are wearing the fanciest stuff at first. So these are some of the first complaints. But we know that this starts in the 11th century because there are people in court fighting their offenses and so on. But the first actual decree that exists from Florence was 1279. So this is a century before. They're complaining about women wearing dresses that are open in the front. They have a lot of fabric in them, more fabric than you need, which means wasteful. Okay? They think that married women should cover their heads with veils. So we think that's only Islamic cultures that like that are fixing on that. But in fact, in the ancient world, they also felt that women should cover their hair. The hair is kind of exotic, an attractor. And so in Florence, you were supposed to cover your hair. And married women sometimes, especially the young ones, didn't like to cover their hair, so this is a problem for them. And then clothes that are sewn artificially from different types of cloth. So it's like patchwork clothes. So here are some pictures of things. What they mean by the clothes sewn out of different fabrics is these party-colored things, where here's a guy with a tunic on, and one side is striped and the other side is red. And then here's somebody a century later working outside, hoeing in his little garment that has one side out of one color and another side out of another color. I think this meant for them, again, you're wasting fabric if you're cutting half out of one thing and half out of another. And then this woman down here, she's wearing a fur mantle that's quite long and trailing along the ground. It looks great, but it's using too much fabric. It's also probably not doing a nice thing to the fabric at the end. It's lined in the hot fur of this time period was squirrel. Right? Imagine all those little squirrels running around you or I. And I like the tummy of the squirrel, the white tummy of the squirrel. That was called miniver. And they just loved it. So she's got a miniver cloak here. And these women up here, they're covering their hair, but they've got very, very fine linen, super fine linen, and they've got a lot of jewels on here. That's too much display according to the church and the government rulers. So that's the kind of thing that they're complaining about. But it's existing before what? Before the mid-14th century is our point. Here's some more about this Blio. Already at Chartres Cathedral, you might know this image as well. It's a famous image of a Gothic cathedral from 1150. And this woman here, the third one over, you can see her garment is very closely fitted. You can see the swell of her belly and belt there. So again, this is fitting before 1350. There was some interesting literature focusing on this in Dress, a journal of a society that several of us in the room belong to. And there are many examples before 1350 where it's tight-laced through the midsection. Even earlier than that, in 1066, we see one of the few women that's in the Bayeux Tapestry. There are only 3 women that are pictured, and this one's carrying her little boy away. They've got tunics on, but she's got a tunic with quite long sleeves. Someone tried to recreate this and decided that this is the way it was made. So you don't need to have those excess sleeves, so that's really a fashion impulse. Earlier, way earlier than formally, people believed that fashion started. Okay. So next.
So why not earlier? Why not fashion earlier in Europe, for example, particularly in ancient times? So I'm sort of a prehistory, ancient history specialist, and that's my turn. We're going to look at some Roman women's hairstyles because you will see very quickly how very different they can be from one another. In fact, you needed a particularly trained slave to do your hair, an ornatrice, that's their name, ornatrice, to style your hair if you were of the elite class and needed to have your hair done. They used hair dyes, they used hair switches, they used ornaments in their hair, they used things underneath their hair to prop it up. They used pollen from plants to dye it, for instance. So here's an example from what's called the Flavian period, so it's early in the Roman era. You see it's from in the 1st century. And it's the head of Vibia, I'm not good at Italian, sorry, Vibia Matilda. And you can see in this side shot how drastically her hair is styled. So it's been sort of partitioned across ear to ear, and then part of it brought to the front and part of it brought to the back. You can see an ornate bun, sort of braids and things arranged in the back. And then in the front, this wonderful, abundant crescent of curls. There's probably a lot of fake hair here, or hair from other people. Because certainly as dominators, they had the ability to gather hair from others, right? To take hair from others, to ask for their hair, cut their hair off. And That was one of the ways they would get hair, from Asia and from the quote barbarians, or people from Northern Europe who wore their hair long and down. So we can definitely see that it's a complicated hairstyle, would require help and lots of added support. And in fact, in these next two, we're going to see the use of wigs. So well documented by archaeologists and people who actually seriously focus upon Roman culture and women in Roman culture. There are a few specialists who really focus just on grooming habits. And here we see the real clear use of switches. So this woman who's closer to me, she's wearing a false wool, probably like sheep's wool, braided piece. It just starts and ends abruptly. It's probably even a contrasting color to the rest of her hair. And if we were to look closely, we might see tendrils of her own hair peeking out.
Yeah, it's right here, isn't it?
Yeah, little piece. When you view it separately, you might be able to get close enough to see. The second one away from me is similar to Vivia that we just looked at, with the push forward and the bun in the back. So variations within a style, that's part of what we think of as fashion, and difference in style, that's also something we think of as fashion. So these two women didn't live at the same time in this image, right? And then the third one. This one is a completely different look and could possibly be a wig, and when you look closely you will see that it is. So this is the bust of Julia Domna, and she was an empress in the 2nd century, you see here. 170 to 200, 2nd and 3rd I should say, 217. And it's a style of the Antonine imperial period. And she is wearing a wig. You can clearly see the little tendrils that come down here. So it's carefully arranged and styled into abundant curls. There's no big bun in the back or anything. Now she actually was from Syria, a country that's in the news a lot today. So ethnically she was Syrian. She probably did have her own abundant curly hair, but she's wearing a wig because the fashion is to wear the wig. Right? The fashion is not to wear your own hair, but to wear false hair. So how was fashion information diffused? Because that becomes a question. Fashion, we assume, can't exist unless the information or the looks become diffused among other people, so that there's that change process and the adoption process. But it was similarly arranged, this transformation of information in Rome, just as it would be in the 18th and 17th centuries much later in Europe. That there would be an imperial group, right, the emperor's household. The empress probably, or the emperor, would set a style based on their own taste or something that inspired them or that they saw that they liked and they made a variation upon. And then those within the court would copy and it would then move onward. So for instance, these hairstyles that I just showed you, those are all elite women who were memorialized in beautiful sculptures, right? But there were successful businesswomen who had little shops. Maybe they were great weavers or great bakers. And the tradition was to memorialize yourself if you made money. So you would have created before your own death your own stele or headpiece, so to speak. And there are examples of many women who were not of the elite class, not from the imperial palace, but they memorialized themselves with lesser versions of the very same hairstyles. So they were copied by the people that were further down them on the socioeconomic scale within the Roman culture. Yeah, I talked about the barbarians. So problem number 2 in fashion history literature. I'll let you do this.
It's always equated with Western Europe, so what about the rest of the world? Why not outside of Europe? There were other important places, important courts that were quite influential. The Ottoman court, this is Turkey. They had beautiful, beautiful textiles, and you can almost argue that the sophistication there was greater than many areas in Europe, especially the northern parts of Europe. We're also going to give you an example of Chinese makeup, because the lip fashions, the way they placed lipstick on their face and used cosmetics changed over time. And then more recently in Nigeria, I mean, Africa's tough because it was hard to get a lot of documentation there from many centuries ago. But looking more recently, there are definite rap styles that change over relatively short periods of time. So let's just take a brief look at a few of these. Mehmet II is a Turkish ruler, and it's kind of interesting in the Ottoman Empire that all the rulers had their clothes saved when they died, and they're all at Topkapi Saray, which is in Istanbul. Of course, the day I went to visit there, the costume area was closed, so I have to go back another time. Anyway, you can see that these clothes, it's a kaftan. He has other garments underneath. He has a head wrap that we associate with Middle Eastern fashion, Middle Eastern dress. But when you start looking at this, the fashion wasn't in the cut of the clothes, because they kept the same kaftans century after century, but they changed the fabric. And there were court designers who designed the textiles, and from there, others would copy it, and it would diffuse out through the empire. So this is, they think that this one was worn by Mehmet II, 1451 to 81. And then later, one of the brothers, 19 brothers of Mehmet III, the Ottoman emperors had harems and multiple wives. So you could have 19 brothers, and there was a lot of competition among the brothers. So this brother was actually slain, and they know it's his kaftan. But you can see the stylistic difference between this and this. It's become more abstract and a little later in time here. Okay, there's an exhibition that was at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. that looked at this one particular style of Ottoman textiles that were based on floral art. And they traced this to one court designer. So it's equivalent to one fashion designer creating a style that everyone else copies and gradually trickles out to the whole empire and beyond, because Ottoman design was very influential in Eastern Europe for a long period of time. So one court designer, and this particular kaftan was dated to the third quarter of the 16th century, so this is affiliated with this particular designer. Okay, now moving to China. So that was one example outside Europe.
Another one outside of Europe. This one is whereas my Roman examples, that was a 200-year period. This is a 2,000-year period. So actually I lifted this artwork, so to speak, or borrowed this artwork from a Chinese source, and then redrew it and amplified it with additional examples. So they had already put on a historic webpage about the lip fashions. So what Dr. Welters was trying to describe was they would use white paste to paint their faces and obliterate their lips, and then redraw their lips. Same thing with their eyebrows. So they would cover those and then draw a new face, so to speak. So what you can see here is from the Han Dynasty all the way down to the Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty that was overthrown in 1911, before China became a republic for a little while and then a communist country after that. A variety of styles. I can give you some simple description, however. Mostly, they've been traced to shapes of fans, paper fans, or folded fans, either flat ones or sort of the traditional kind we think of from Asia, or the kind that folds like that and then opens up. And petals from flowers, or an entire flower, all right? So they relate to things that are familiar in the cultures, these various dynasties across 2,000 years. So you can see, I think, that if we look at a view here. So this is Ladies of the Palace, is this large piece of art from 720 to about 800 in the first millennium after the birth of Christ. So in what's known as the Tang Dynasty. So she's a beautiful, stylish-looking woman with that white, pasty, painted skin. But here, if we look closely, maybe you can blow this up sometime at home. We have the video. Her lips are painted in a very small and narrow shape, only for the center of her mouth, whereas the outer part's been obliterated. And, of course, the beautiful flower and the stylized hair. Here's one that's a little later, from 1738 to 1798. It's not exactly dated, this artwork, but it is a portrait of a concubine from the imperial palace. And again, her lips, the upper lip has been made very low, so there's just a tiny bit of it painted red, and then the lower lip is red. So that you can, when you look at it more closely, be able to see this. So manipulating the shape of hers. Now, not only elites, so here we see two young women who are workers. They're working where they're reeling silk off of the cocoons of silk caterpillars, right? So they have the cocoons, actually. But if we look more closely, she has a lip shape that you'll be able to pair to this one. It's the third one from the bottom. And I traced it to the shape of an orchid. So it's like an orchid that grew in the region. So it's got two little puffs on the top and then a little dot-like in the center of the lower lip. So not just elites, but working class girls.
So one of our colleagues, Joanne Eicher, has done a lot of work on Nigerian dress, particularly in the Kalabari area, and documented change over periods of time. She's collected a lot of textiles, has a lot of photographs and so on, and she documents changes in the way that the wrappers are tied. So different ways on the head, different ways on the body. We don't have a lot of pictures, but here are some more recent. This is actually her photograph as well, and this is one that's more recent, and she certainly appears to be a fashionista, quite elaborate wrapping of the head. Also, many of these textiles are imported, so there's a fashion in the kinds of textiles that are used as well. So yet another example from an area outside Europe. Okay, so what about, why do we think this is an important thing to do? Because fashion history is taught at many colleges and universities. And you here have the option of taking one of several courses. We do have a Western dress history class here as well as a 20th century class that most of you take. It's also taught at community colleges and technical schools. There, just within the last 20 years, many other disciplines have become interested in fashion as part of cultural studies, anthropology, art history, programs that are called cultural studies. Geography is interested in how fashion helps define a place. It's very popular in museums. We just had a fashion exhibition at the Met that broke all records for all fashion exhibitions. Even the one from Alexander McQueen, that was called Savage Beauty, that was the previous record breaker. So people love to go to these exhibitions. They understand fashion. They can understand the display of fashion in museums. There are lots of new journals on fashion. A long time ago, there really wasn't very much opportunity to publish your work on this, but now there are many opportunities, more than we can take advantage of, really. New publishers are picking up on fashion lists, so it's not so hard to find a publisher for your books. It's not really a dirty word anymore, and it's commanding a much larger discussion than before, so that's why we think it's time to change the world with fashion, what people consider fashion history. So the old definition, it excludes Japanese kimono. So here's the title of a book that's been around for a while from Sharon Takeda from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, when art became fashion. So they're understanding the kimono, which is like some other garments, it's a garment that is not shaped close to the body, but the textiles are fabulous and an art form in themselves, and they go through change over time. The Chinese qipao, you saw some examples with the lip fashions, these change over time. Indian saris are well known for the same draping on the body, but very distinct time periods when things go in and out of fashion. Indonesian batik is an area that Abby has done some work in that also has very time-defined styles. So why are these not fashion? So here's our plan to change the world.
Right, so the title of this presentation is the title of our forthcoming book, right? So that's sort of the link to the beginning. So we're working on a book. It's already been accepted by the publisher. It won't be out till 2017. Things take time. There's a whole process. But it's called Fashion History, A Global View, and it's the Bloomsbury publisher, the big publisher in fashion and academia these days. Of course, that is an intellectual argument. We're giving you sort of the skeleton of the intellectual argument, but it goes off into deep things about theory and, you know, names about who said what, and it gets very detailed in order to make our point with that information and examples. But to get to all those thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are indoctrinated about fashion in colleges, universities, community colleges, technical schools, or even just dilettantes who pick up a book because they're interested, we need to write something more like a textbook after the intellectual argument is out there and is reviewed and discussed, so that we hope to, before too long, move to the next level, which would be a textbook that is more encompassing about understanding fashion, therefore is more diverse and would include additional cultures, wouldn't exclude cultures. I really get excited about that part, because I feel that when we developed over the historic time this very narrow definition of fashion, really what it was doing was setting up a Western preferred, as Dr. Welters pointed out, definition. It was exclusionary rather than inclusionary, and so the objective is to do the intellectual argument, do the textbook, and change people's minds.
Maybe we'll have a new course at URI.
That's it.
Questions, comments?
I'm currently taking a fashion theory course right now with Carl, and I just saw a lot of really interesting, I guess, similarities, because the whole fashion theory course is pretty much about just the idea of fashion and what is fashion, like the world of fashion now and how it used to be and stuff like that. And I just saw a combination of that. I think there's a lot of people in that class as well.
Certainly,
That was really interesting.
fashion is in almost every place, even the old definition of fashion. People everywhere are wearing Western style clothes, but with their own skin on it. I don't know if we spent time talking about that, but it's a big dialogue in the field here.
I'll just chime in. I talked with Carl today, so I'm for lunch with Dr. Ordonez. He was talking about using the Sandra Neeson piece, which is in our book, because we put in our first book, we put in extracts from other thinkers, and of course one of the areas we addressed was fashion theory. So we were on that trail trying to pull together other thinkers who helped us gel our ideas. But you're right, and so Sandra Neeson would be a woman who worked with graduate students in Australia and developed this idea of reorienting fashion, as in bring in the Orient, bring in Asia, don't leave Asia out.
Dr. Hamilton.
So, could you argue that if you go all the way back to our brains, and argue that there's a fundamental human need for innovation to change. It's based on our brain. Are you gonna talk about that at all?
Yes.
Yes, we do. Yes, we
Fashion
do.
impulse.
Yeah.
Even early on, people put ornaments on their body before they put other things. There's some really, really old skeletons that have been discovered, and they've got jewelry, shell jewelry all over them.
Yeah, we have beads from 30,000 years ago. That's our oldest ornamentation, 30,000 years ago.
So we like to be decorated before even we like to be worn.
So good point, Dr. Ham. Anyone else?
Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you.